Most horror films end the same way. The screen fades to black. The credits roll. And whatever happened on screen is meant to stay there. But some films refuse that agreement. They don't end when the images stop moving. They don't dissolve into memory as entertainment. Instead, they linger quietly, persistently, long after the viewing experience is over. Not as fear, but as discomfort, as doubt, as questions that don't settle with time. These are not films remembered for individual scenes or shocking moments. They are remembered for the way they felt afterward, for the unease that followed people home, for the arguments they sparked, for the way audiences struggled to explain why something about them felt wrong, sometimes years after first seeing them. In many cases, their initial reception was uncertain or divided. Some were misunderstood, some were dismissed. Others provoked reactions that critics couldn't quite articulate at the time. Yet instead of fading, their reputations evolved. They resurfaced in conversations. They were reassessed. They stayed alive in ways that more immediately successful films did not. This video is not about how frightening these films were in the moment. It's about what they left behind. We're looking at horror movies that continued to exist after the credits rolled through. Psychological discomfort, moral unease, cultural backlash, and long-term reevaluation. Films that settled into the audience's memory and refused to leave quietly. Because the most enduring horror isn't what happens while you're watching. It's what stays with you afterward. 1. Possession, 1981. Minimal context. Possession was released into an environment unprepared for its emotional and thematic extremity. Immediate reaction. Early reactions were intense and divisive. Some viewers rejected the film as incomprehensible, while others described it as profoundly unsettling, without being able to explain its effect. The lingering effect. What remained was not shock, but exhaustion. Audiences reported feeling emotionally drained, haunted by the film's tone rather than its imagery. The experience lingered as something difficult to categorize or leave behind. Evolution of reputation. Over time, the film's reputation transformed dramatically. Once dismissed by many, it came to be recognized as a work of enduring psychological impact, frequently cited as a film that refuses to fade from memory. Why it still matters. The film remains significant because it exemplifies horror that does not resolve. It stays active in memory, not as fear, but as an unresolved emotional imprint. 2. The Brood, 1979. Minimal context. The Brood entered public discourse at a moment when audiences were becoming increasingly attentive to psychological trauma. Immediate reaction. Initial responses were polarized. Some viewers rejected the film outright, finding its implications difficult to process, while others fixated on its emotional intensity, without fully articulating why it felt so invasive. The lingering effect. What stayed with audiences was a sense of discomfort tied to responsibility and consequence. The film was often recalled not for its events, but for the moral unease it produced, an unease that resurfaced unexpectedly in later reflection. Evolution of reputation. As cultural conversations around trauma and inherited harm evolved, the film was re-evaluated as more psychologically resonant than initially acknowledged. Its reputation deepened rather than softened with time. Why it still matters. The film endures because it confronts viewers with implications that cannot be easily dismissed, allowing discomfort to persist beyond immediate reaction. 3. Images, 1972. Minimal context. Images was released during a period when psychological horror was still expected to provide interpretive clarity by its conclusion. Immediate reaction. Early reactions were restrained and uncertain. Many viewers found the film difficult to discuss, often describing it as confusing rather than disturbing and struggling to summarize what it had done to them. The lingering effect. What persisted was not narrative confusion, but perceptual doubt. Audiences reported remembering fragments rather than sequences. Faces, voices, moments that felt disconnected, yet emotionally linked. The film lingered as an experience that resisted being reassembled into a coherent memory. Evolution of reputation. Over time, the film was re-examined as an exploration of unstable perception rather than failed storytelling. Its refusal to anchor reality came to be viewed as a deliberate source of long-term unease. Why it still matters. The film remains relevant because it demonstrates how horror can persist by destabilizing memory itself, leaving viewers unsure not of what they saw, but of how they remember it. 4. Let's Scare Jessica to Death. 1971. Minimal context. Let's Scare Jessica to Death was released at a time when psychological instability was rarely portrayed with sustained ambiguity. Immediate reaction. Initial audiences often describe the film as unsettling, without being able to specify why. Some found its restraint frustrating, others quietly disturbing. The lingering effect. What remained was doubt. Viewers reported lingering uncertainty about what they had witnessed, replaying the film mentally in search of confirmation that never arrived. Evolution of reputation. Over time, the film came to be recognized for its refusal to provide reassurance. Its ambiguity was reframed as a deliberate source of psychological persistence. Why it still matters. The film continues to resonate because it demonstrates how unresolved perception can remain active in memory long after narrative details have faded. 5. The Kindred, 1987. Minimal context. The Kindred was released during a period when body horror was increasingly explicit and confrontational. Immediate reaction. Early reactions were conflicted. Some viewers focused on its physical elements, while others expressed discomfort with its thematic implications. The film did not achieve broad consensus upon release. The lingering effect. What stayed with audiences was not spectacle, but implication. Viewers often recalled a persistent unease related to inheritance and inevitability ideas that continued to surface long after the film ended. Evolution of reputation. As discussions around bodily autonomy and generational consequence evolved, the film was revisited with greater seriousness. Its reputation shifted toward recognition as a psychologically persistent work. Why it still matters. The film endures because it illustrates how horror can linger through implication, leaving behind questions that feel personal rather than resolved. 6. Messiah of Evil, 1973. Minimal context. Messiah of Evil entered circulation quietly, without the kind of distribution or promotion that typically defines a film's early reputation. Immediate reaction. Initial responses were muted and fragmented. Many viewers encountered the film in isolation, often late at night, or through imperfect prints, which contributed to a sense that the experience itself was incomplete or dislocated. The lingering effect. What lingered was atmosphere rather than incident. Audiences frequently described remembering the film as a place rather than a sequence of events. The coastal setting and its strange social detachment stayed in memory long after specific details faded. Evolution of reputation. Over time, the film developed a cult reputation rooted in its mood and ambiguity. Its perceived lack of clarity became central to its appeal, discussed as a feature rather than a flaw. Why it still matters. The film remains significant because it demonstrates how environmental unease can outlast narrative, embedding itself in memory as a location that feels permanently unsettled. 7. The Ninth Configuration, 1980. Minimal context. The Ninth Configuration arrived as a film difficult to categorize, blending seriousness with tonal unpredictability. Immediate reaction. Early audiences were uncertain how to respond. Some dismissed the film's tonal shifts as inconsistency, while others found them deeply unsettling. The lingering effect. What persisted was confusion paired with reflection. Viewers often revisited the film intellectually, debating its intent long after watching rather than recalling specific scenes. Evolution of reputation. Over time, the film developed a reputation as a challenging work that resisted easy interpretation. Its refusal to settle into a single tone became a defining characteristic. Why it still matters. The film remains relevant because it demonstrates how unresolved tone can leave a deeper mark than explicit imagery. encouraging prolonged engagement rather than immediate reaction. 8. The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane. 1976. Minimal context. The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane emerged during a period increasingly fascinated with transgressive domestic narratives. Immediate reaction. Initial responses were cautious. Viewers expressed discomfort with the film's restrained tone and its refusal to offer clear moral framing. The unease was noted, but rarely explored. The lingering effect. Audiences frequently recalled the film as emotionally unresolved. The calm surface lingered longer than expected, leading viewers to question what had been left unspoken. The discomfort was subtle, but persistent. Evolution of reputation. In later years, the film gained renewed attention for its unsettling restraint. What was once perceived as ambiguity became central to its lasting reputation. Why it still matters. The film endures because it highlights how silence and omission can produce lasting psychological residue, forcing viewers to confront discomfort without guidance. 9. Don't Look Now, 1973. Minimal context. Don't Look Now was released into a cinematic landscape that still expected emotional closure, even in tragic narratives. Immediate reaction. Early reactions were unsettled and divided. While critics acknowledged the film's seriousness, many viewers struggled to articulate why it felt so disturbing. Discussions often fixated on isolated moments, avoiding the broader emotional impact. The lingering effect. What endured was not fear, but unease tied to inevitability. Audiences reported replaying the film, mentally questioning whether certain moments were memories, premonitions, or coincidences. The experience left viewers doubting their own interpretations. Evolution of reputation. Over time, the film became widely cited as a landmark of psychological disturbance. Its reputation shifted from puzzling to profoundly influential, often referenced in discussions about grief and perception in cinema. Why it still matters. The film remains significant because it demonstrates how horror can reside in recognition rather than revelation, persisting as a quiet disturbance that resists resolution. 10. The Tenant, 1976. Minimal context. The Tenant entered public discussion as a disturbing portrait of identity under pressure. Immediate reaction. Initial responses ranged from discomfort to outright rejection. Many viewers found the film difficult to engage with, citing confusion and emotional distance. The lingering effect. What persisted was a lingering sense of instability. Viewers recalled the film not for specific incidents, but for a gradual erosion of certainty about identity and belonging. Evolution of reputation. Over time, the film's reputation shifted significantly. It came to be viewed as a challenging but influential work, frequently cited in discussions of psychological disintegration in cinema. Why it still matters. The film remains significant because it illustrates how horror can operate as a slow-burning disturbance, one that continues to unsettle long after the viewing experience has ended. 11. The Comeback, 1978. Minimal context. The Comeback was released during a period increasingly focused on trauma and psychological disturbance. Immediate reaction. Early viewers often responded with unease rather than shock. Discussions centered on the film's heavy atmosphere and its refusal to separate past experience from present action. The lingering effect. Audiences reported difficulty leaving the film behind. The blending of memory and experience led many to replay scenes, mentally unsure which moments belonged to recollection and which to reality. Evolution of reputation. As conversations around trauma became more nuanced, the film was reassessed as an early exploration of unresolved psychological aftermath. Its quiet persistence earned it renewed attention. Why it still matters. The film endures because it captures how unresolved experiences can continue to intrude long after events have ended, mirroring the way memories themselves refuse closure. 12. Beyond the Door, 1974. Minimal context. Beyond the Door arrived at a time when possession films were becoming increasingly familiar to audiences. Immediate reaction. Initial reactions were divided. Some viewers dismissed the film as derivative, while others expressed confusion about its tonal instability. It was not widely embraced, nor was it decisively rejected. The lingering effect. What lingered was a sense of dislocation. Viewers struggled to reconcile moments of domestic normalcy with abrupt shifts in behavior, often recalling the film as strangely fragmented. The experience resisted neat categorization, leaving behind unease rather than clarity. Evolution of reputation. Over time, the film gained attention not for originality, but for the way it unsettled expectations of consistency. Its uneven reception became part of its identity, discussed as an example of horror that disrupts rather than satisfies. Why it still matters. The film remains relevant because it demonstrates how discomfort can persist when a work refuses to align fully with genre conventions, leaving audiences uncertain about how to process what they've seen. 13. Symptoms, 1974. Minimal context. Symptoms was released quietly and largely overlooked upon initial distribution. Immediate reaction. When it was seen, responses were subdued. The film did not provoke strong reactions so much as muted discomfort. Viewers often reported feeling uncertain about whether anything significant had happened at all. The lingering effect. That uncertainty became the film's most persistent after effect. Audiences remembered the atmosphere more than events, and the absence of narrative momentum left a lingering sense of emotional stagnation. Evolution of reputation. Years later, the film was re-examined as an example of psychological horror that prioritized internal unease over external incident. Its quietness became a point of interest rather than a liability. Why it still matters. The film endures because it illustrates how horror can persist without spectacle remaining in memory as a feeling that never demanded attention, but never fully disappeared either. 14. The Killing Kind, 1973. Minimal context. The Killing Kind emerged during a decade increasingly interested in psychological instability. But it resisted clear alignment with genre expectations. Immediate reaction. Early viewers often described the film as uncomfortable without being overtly shocking. Reactions focused less on content and more on tone. Something felt persistently off but difficult to define. The lingering effect. The film left audiences questioning character motivation long after viewing. Rather than debating events, people debated interpretation. The lack of clear psychological framing caused unease that extended beyond the runtime. Evolution of reputation. As conversations around psychological horror matured, the film gained recognition for its refusal to explain behavior. What was once seen as vagueness became associated with restraint and unease. Why it still matters. The film's endurance lies in its capacity to unsettle interpretation. It resists closure, encouraging viewers to revisit not the story, but their assumptions about understanding it. 15. The Psychopath, 1966. Minimal context. The Psychopath was released during a period when British horror was expected to be tidy, moral, and clearly structured. Immediate reaction. Initial responses to the film were mixed. Many viewers struggled to articulate what felt wrong about it, often describing it as uneven or oddly paced, without being able to explain why. It didn't provoke outrage or acclaim, it produced hesitation. The lingering effect. What stayed with audiences was not a specific moment, but a persistent sense that something had been missed. Viewers reported remembering the film as incomplete, as though crucial information had slipped past unnoticed. This uncertainty became part of the experience rather than a flaw to be corrected. Evolution of reputation. Over time, the film came to be re-evaluated, less as a failed mystery and more as an unsettling experiment in withheld clarity. Its refusal to guide the audience began to feel intentional, even if that intent was never clearly stated. Why it still matters. The film remains relevant because it demonstrates how ambiguity itself can become a lasting psychological residue, one that does not resolve with explanation, but deepens with reflection. These films endured not because they frightened audiences in the moment, but because they left something unresolved afterward. They lingered through discomfort, debate, misinterpretation, and reconsideration, remaining active in memory long after the experience of watching had ended. So consider this as the discussion continues. Which of these films stayed with you the longest and why? Was it confusion, moral unease, emotional residue, or something harder to define? And which horror film do you believe deserves to be reconsidered today? Not for its scares, but for the lasting impact it left behind. Your perspective is part of that ongoing afterlife.